The massive alien ship hung in space above Earth, like a dark cloud blocking the sun. Council Prime Zexthara stood on the bridge of the Eternal Harmony, its crystalline body glowing with a cold blue light as it stared at the small blue planet. Below, the ship was so large that entire cities could fit inside its hull, and it carried weapons that could crack a planet in half with a single shot. Zexthara had done this same ritual 1,200 times before with 1,200 different worlds. The pattern was always the same. Show up with overwhelming force, make the demands, wait for the inevitable surrender. No species had ever been foolish enough to refuse the Council's generous offer of protection and guidance. The crystalline being touched a control panel with one of its many arms. A holographic display showed Earth spinning slowly in the void, its white clouds swirling over blue oceans and brown continents. Such a pretty little world, Zexthara thought. It would be a shame to destroy it, but the Council had rules that could not be broken. Around the bridge, representatives from the other Council species watched the proceedings with bored expressions. Vorthak of the hegemony clicked his six-clawed arms together in impatience. The insectoid creature had been through this process hundreds of times and wanted to get it over with. Sifela from the Tide Worlds floated in her water-filled containment suit, her tentacles drifting lazily as she studied the human world below. "Send the message," Zexthara commanded in the universal galactic language. The communication beam shot down toward Earth, carrying the same ultimatum that had been delivered to every world in the galaxy for the past 3,000 years. On Earth, deep beneath the city of Washington, in a reinforced bunker that could survive a nuclear war, President Jake Morrison sat at a long table surrounded by his most trusted advisors. The room was lit by harsh fluorescent lights that made everyone look pale and tired. Morrison was a big man with gray hair and weathered hands that showed he had worked hard all his life before becoming president. He had been a Marine for 20 years before going into politics, and he still carried himself like a soldier. General Lisa Stone sat to his right, her uniform crisp and her short black hair pulled back severely. She was the head of Earth Defense Command and had spent the last 5 years trying to build up humanity's small space fleet. Her face was grim as she read the message that had just arrived from the alien ship. "They want us to surrender all weapons, accept their rule, and become what they call a protectorate species," Stone said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was saying. "We have 72 hours to comply, or they will destroy every human on Earth." Admiral Chris Walker, commander of Earth's space fleet, shook his head slowly. He was a thin man with kind eyes who had never wanted to be a military leader, but had found himself in charge of humanity's defense when the aliens first appeared at the edge of the solar system. "We have maybe 200 ships total," he said. "Quietly, most of them are converted civilian vessels with weapons, bolted on wherever we could fit them. They have over 10,000 warships, each one more advanced than anything we've ever built." Dr. Amanda Price, Earth's leading expert on alien biology, looked up from her tablet where she had been reading reports from other worlds. She was young for such an important position, barely 30 years old, but she had studied every scrap of information they had about the galactic community. "Every species in the galaxy has eventually surrendered to the Council," she said. "Some fought for a few days or weeks, but they all gave up in the end. The Council has never lost a war." Morrison listened to each report without speaking. He had been elected president because people trusted him to make hard decisions, and this was the hardest decision any human leader had ever faced. Around the table, his advisors waited for him to speak. The weight of 7 billion human lives rested on his shoulders. Finally, Morrison looked around the room at each person. "What do you think our ancestors would have done when facing impossible odds?" he asked. The question hung in the air like smoke. General Stone was the first to answer. "They would have fought," she said simply. "Even if they couldn't win?" Morrison asked. "Especially if they couldn't win," Stone replied. Across the planet, ordinary people were preparing for something they had never imagined they would face. In New York City, construction worker Tony Rodriguez was helping his neighbors turn their apartment building into a fortress. He and his crew had spent their whole lives building things, and now they were using those same skills to create defenses. They welded steel plates over windows and reinforced doorways with concrete barriers. "You really think this will help?" asked his neighbor, Mrs. Chun, an elderly woman who had lived in the building for 40 years. Tony wiped sweat from his forehead and looked at the barricades they had built. "Maybe not," he said honestly, "but I'd rather go down fighting than on my knees." In Tokyo, engineer Kate Yamamoto worked frantically in her small workshop, taking apart radios and televisions and putting them back together in new ways. She had discovered that the electronics could be modified to disrupt certain types of energy fields, though she wasn't sure if it would work against alien technology. Her hands moved quickly as she soldered circuits and rewired components. "Kate, you need to get some sleep," her assistant said from the doorway. "No time," Kate replied without looking up from her work. "If we're going to fight back, we need every advantage we can get." In London, retired soldier Ben Clark gathered his neighbors in the community center. He was an old man now, his hair white and his back bent from years of hard living, but his eyes still held the fire of a warrior. He had fought in 3 wars during his military career and had never backed down from a fight. "I know this seems hopeless," he told the crowd of ordinary citizens who had come to hear him speak. "But I've seen what happens when good people stand together against evil. Sometimes the impossible becomes possible." Back in the bunker beneath Washington, President Morrison stood up from the table and walked to the wall where a large screen showed the alien ship, hanging over Earth like a sword ready to fall. He thought about all the presidents who had come before him, all the leaders who had faced impossible choices and somehow found the courage to do what was right. He turned back to his advisors and made his decision. "Set up a worldwide broadcast," he said. "I want to speak to every human on Earth." An hour later, Morrison stood behind a podium in the bunker's communication center. Behind him hung the American flag, but his words would speak for all humanity. Cameras broadcast his image to every television, computer, and phone screen on the planet. 7 billion people stopped what they were doing to listen to their president. Morrison looked directly into the camera, his weathered face showing no fear despite the magnitude of what he was about to say. "My fellow humans," he began, his voice strong and clear, "we have received the Galactic Council's ultimatum. They demand that we surrender our weapons, accept their rule, and become subjects in their empire. They promise us safety and protection if we comply. They threaten us with total destruction if we refuse." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of those words sink in around the world. In living rooms and offices, in schools and hospitals, people held their breath waiting for his next words. "I have consulted with leaders from every nation on Earth," Morrison continued. "We have examined our military capabilities and found them wanting. We have studied the fate of other worlds, and then found no hope of victory. By every measure of logic and reason, we should accept their terms and live as their subjects." Another pause. Somewhere in the darkness of space above, alien eyes watched and waited for humanity's inevitable surrender. Morrison straightened his shoulders and looked directly into the camera. "My answer, on behalf of the human race, is simple," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 7 billion souls. "No." The word echoed around the world and up into the void of space, where it struck the Galactic Council like a physical blow. For the first time in 3,000 years, someone had simply said no. Council Prime Zexthara stared at the communication display in complete silence. The crystalline being had lived for over 1,000 years and had witnessed the surrender of 1,200 different worlds. Never in all that time had anyone simply said no to the Council's ultimatum. The word hung in the air of the bridge like poison. Vorthak clicked his mandibles together nervously. The six-armed insectoid had been present for 800 of those surrenders, and he had never seen anything like this. Perhaps they misunderstood the transmission, he suggested, his voice carrying a tremor of uncertainty. No species chooses extinction over integration into our glorious empire. Sifela flowed uneasily in her water-filled containment suit. The aquatic being had spent considerable time studying human history and culture in preparation for this conquest. What she had learned disturbed her more than she cared to admit. "I have reviewed their historical records," she said, her voice creating bubbles in the water around her. "They are different from other species we have encountered. They wage wars against their own kind that last for decades. They have never properly learned the art of surrender." Zexthara turned away from the display and faced the other council members. For the first time in its long existence, it felt something it had never experienced before: doubt. "Show them our power," it commanded. "Perhaps a demonstration will help them understand the futility of resistance." The order went out across the council fleet. Within minutes, every weapon on every ship turned toward a single target: asteroid. Mining Station Alpha 7, humanity's farthest outpost from Earth. The station housed 50,000 miners and their families, all working to extract rare minerals from the asteroid belt. It was a peaceful place where humans had built a small community among the stars. The combined firepower of 1,000 council warships struck the mining station simultaneously. The explosion was so bright that it briefly outshone the sun itself, visible from Earth as a new star that flared and died in the space of heartbeats. 50,000 human lives ended in an instant, vaporized by alien weapons that turned matter itself into energy. On Earth, the loss hit humanity like a physical blow. Jenny Martinez sat in her office at NASA headquarters, watching the real-time data feed from the deep space monitoring stations. She was the daughter of one of the miners on Alpha 7, a man who had worked in space for 20 years to provide for his family. As the signal from the station went dead, she felt her world collapse around her. Tears streamed down her face as she realized her father was gone, along with everyone else she had known at the mining station. But as she sat there in her grief, something unexpected happened. Instead of breaking her spirit, the attack filled her with a cold rage that burned hotter than the explosion that had killed her father. Jenny wiped her eyes and turned to her computer. She began typing rapidly, sending messages to every space-capable nation on Earth. If the aliens wanted to demonstrate their power, she would help humanity demonstrate something in return, that killing their people only made them more determined to fight. Across the planet, the reaction was the same. Instead of cowering in fear, humans responded to the attack with fury. Recruitment centers that had been busy before now overflowed with volunteers. Men and women who had never considered military service lined up for blocks to enlist. Factories that had been producing cars and televisions retooled their assembly lines to make weapons. And ammunition. In Detroit, factory worker Carlos Murphy had been building automobiles for 15 years. Now he stood on the factory floor watching as robotic arms that once assembled car doors were being reprogrammed to manufacture rifle barrels. "Guess we're not making cars anymore," he said to his supervisor. "No," the supervisor replied grimly. "We're making war." President Morrison called an emergency meeting with every world leader. In secure communication centers around the globe, prime ministers and presidents gathered to hear what the American leader had to say. Prime Minister Helen Davies sat in her bunker beneath London, her usually perfect hair disheveled from hours of crisis meetings. Chancellor Franz Mueller connected from Berlin, his face showing the strain of trying to prepare his nation for an impossible war. President Liu Wei joined from Beijing, flanked by his military advisors, who looked as grim as he did. They killed 50,000 of our people to make a point, Morrison said without preamble. They want us to be afraid. They want us to reconsider our position and accept their terms. And will we? Asked Davies, though she already knew the answer. Morrison's face was like carved stone. If we're going down, we're taking as many of these aliens with us as possible. Every nation, every resource, every person who can hold a weapon. This isn't about countries anymore. This is about the human race. One by one, the leaders pledged their nation's support. Old enemies found themselves on the same side for the first time in decades. Nations that had been at war with each other, just months before now, shared their most advanced military technologies freely. The Council, monitoring these communications, grew increasingly confused. Zexthara had expected the demonstration of power to break human resistance. Instead, it seemed to have made them more unified and determined. The crystalline being called for another council session. Their response is unexpected, admitted. Council member Thyrith, a gaseous being from the outer rim worlds. Most species begin negotiating for better terms after we demonstrate our capabilities. But the humans did not negotiate. Instead, they sent another message to the Council fleet. This time, it was not President Morrison who spoke, but a simple recording that played on every Council ship simultaneously. It showed scenes from human history. Soldiers fighting impossible odds at a place called Thermopylae, defenders dying at something called the Alamo, civilians resisting in a place called Stalingrad. We didn't say negotiate, Morrison's voice played over the images. We said no. Dr. Paul Jensen had been a peaceful man his entire life. He was a physicist who had spent his career studying the fundamental forces of the universe, driven by curiosity rather than any desire for conflict. But as he watched the footage of the mining station's destruction, something changed inside him. He closed his research into clean energy and opened new files focused on weapons development. How can we hurt them? He asked his research team. They have better technology, better ships, better weapons, but they must have weaknesses. His team worked around the clock, analyzing every scrap of data they had about alien technology. They studied the energy signatures from the Council ships, looking for patterns and vulnerabilities. They examined the wreckage of alien probes that had crashed on Earth during the first contact attempts. Across the globe, similar scenes played out in laboratories and workshops. Dr. Susan Clark in Atlanta began experimenting with biological weapons, testing Earth bacteria against samples of alien tissue. Engineer Kate Yamamoto in Tokyo worked to modify human electronics to interfere with alien systems. In every major city, scientists abandoned their peaceful research to focus on one goal, finding ways to fight back against impossible odds. The Council sent a third message to Earth, this time offering better terms. They would allow humans to keep some of their weapons, to maintain limited self-governance, to retain more of their cultural identity. It was a more generous offer than had ever been made to any species in galactic history. Morrison's response was broadcast not just to Earth, but to every world in the galaxy. Standing in the ruins of the mining station's control center on Earth, surrounded by photographs of the families who had died in the attack, he looked directly into the camera. "You killed our people to make us afraid," he said, his voice carrying across space to reach billions of enslaved beings on thousands of worlds. "You offered us chains made of gold instead of iron. You think we will negotiate because we are weak." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You don't understand humans at all. The more you hurt us, the harder we fight. The more you threaten us, the less we fear you. We are not like the other species you have conquered. We choose death before dishonor. On distant worlds, beings who had lived under council rule for centuries heard those words and felt something they had not experienced in generations: hope. In the slave quarters of mining worlds, in the labor camps of agricultural planets, in the research facilities where alien scientists worked under council oversight, the word spread quickly. Someone had finally said no. Someone was finally fighting. Back, Zexthara felt the foundations of the galactic order beginning to shake beneath its crystalline feet. The council fleet moved like a dark cloud across the solar system. Over 10,000 ships of various sizes and shapes spreading out in formation as they approached Earth. From the bridge of the Eternal Harmony, Zexthara watched the tactical display showing the positions of human forces. The numbers were laughably small compared to the Council Armada. Admiral Chris Walker stood on the bridge of the ESS Defiance, humanity's largest warship, though it was barely a tenth the size of the smallest Council vessel. Around him, his bridge. Crew worked frantically at their stations, coordinating with the 200 ships that made up Earth's entire space fleet. Walker was a quiet man who had never wanted to be a military commander, but circumstances had thrust him into the role of humanity's last defender. "Admiral, we're receiving final position reports from all ships," reported Lieutenant Maria Santos, his communications officer. She was young, barely out of the Space Academy, but she had volunteered to stay at her post, even though everyone knew this would likely be a one-way mission. Walker nodded and opened a channel to address his fleet. "All ships, this is Admiral Walker. We all know the odds we're facing today. We have 200 ships against their 10,000. Our weapons are primitive compared to theirs. Our armor is thin. Our experience is limited." He paused, looking out at the stars where his small fleet waited. "But we have something they don't understand. We're fighting for our home. We're fighting for our families. We're fighting for the right to exist as free human beings." The human fleet did not charge headlong into battle as the Council expected. Instead, they executed a plan that had been developed by military strategists from every nation on Earth, working together. The entire solar system had been turned into a massive trap over the past 72 hours. With every available resource devoted to creating defensive positions and hidden weapons, Captain Ryan Davis commanded the destroyer Issa Wolverine, leading what appeared to be a desperate frontal assault against the leading edge of the Council fleet. His ship was small and fast, armed with missiles the human engineers had worked day and night to upgrade with whatever technology they could salvage or steal from alien probes. "All right, people," Davis said to his crew as they accelerated toward the alien fleet. "Remember, we're not trying to win this fight. We're trying to make them follow us." The Wolverine and 50 other small ships charged directly at the Council formation, firing everything they had. The aliens responded exactly as the humans had hoped, pursuing what they saw as a desperate and doomed attack. But as the Council ships gave chase, they flew directly into the asteroid belt that human engineers had spent weeks preparing. Nuclear mines, hidden among the asteroids, detonated in carefully timed sequences. Entire sections of the alien fleet disappeared in brilliant flashes of light and radiation. The Council had shields that could stop most weapons, but they had not expected the humans to turn the asteroids themselves into bombs. On Earth, civilian Lisa Chung sat in a communications center buried deep beneath the city of New York, coordinating global communications as quantum jamming from the alien fleet tried to isolate human forces from each other. She had been a telephone operator before the crisis began, but now she was one of the most important people in the war effort, keeping scattered human forces connected across the planet. "Ground control to lunar base," she spoke into her headset. "Council ships are breaking through the outer defenses. Estimate 15 minutes until they reach high orbit." The response came from Captain Beth Miller, commanding the hastily constructed weapons platform on the dark side of the moon. Copy. That, ground control. All lunar systems are hot and ready. We'll give them everything we've got. In underground bunkers across Earth, civilians who had never imagined they would become soldiers operated missile defense systems and radar stations. In rural Iowa, 80-year-old Rose Patterson sat at a control console for a surface-to-air battery, her weathered hands steady on the targeting controls. She had been a school teacher for 50 years before retiring, but when the government asked for volunteers to operate the defense systems, she had been the first to sign up. "Mrs. Patterson, we're showing incoming targets on your sector," came the voice from the command center. "I see them, honey," Rose replied calmly, her fingers moving over the controls with surprising skill. "Don't you worry about old Rose. I'll send those aliens packing." The Council fleet was shocked not just by human military tactics, but by their unity. Species that had been at war with each other for millennia were now fighting as one. Russian pilot Alexei Petrov flew wing to wing with American ace Maria Gonzalez, their national differences forgotten in the face of a common enemy. Former enemies had become brothers and sisters in arms, but despite their courage and determination, the numbers were still overwhelming. One by one, human ships began to fall. The ESS Wolverine, having led the Council fleet into the asteroid trap, was caught in the crossfire of alien weapons. Captain Davis felt his ship shudder as plasma beams punched through the hull. "Hull breach in sections 4 through 7, reported his damage control officer. "Life support is failing. Engines are offline." Davis looked around his bridge at the young men and women who had followed him into this impossible fight. "All hands, this is the captain. It's been an honor serving with you. Abandon ship." But even as the human fleet was pushed back toward Earth, taking terrible losses, their sacrifice was buying precious time for the planet below. Phase 2 of humanity's defense plan was about to begin. Admiral Walker's flagship, the Defiance, was crippled and burning, its hull breached in dozens of places. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows across the bridge as the crew worked to keep basic systems running. Walker himself was wounded, blood seeping from a cut on his forehead, but he remained at his post. "Admiral, we're losing life support on decks 5 through 12, reported his chief engineer. "The ship won't hold together much longer." Walker opened a final communication channel to Earth. "This is Admiral Walker to all stations planetside. We've bought you all the time we can. The fleet is broken. Whatever you're planning down there, now would be a good time." As the Council fleet closed in on Earth, expecting to find a defenseless planet ready for occupation, they encountered something that no species in galactic history had ever attempted. Every satellite in Earth orbit, from communications relays to weather monitoring stations, suddenly revealed hidden weapons that had been disguised as civilian equipment. The International Space Station, which the aliens had dismissed as a harmless research facility, unfolded like a flower to reveal missile launchers and energy weapons. Communication satellites that had been broadcasting television signals just hours before now fired particle beams at the approaching alien ships. Even the Hubble Space Telescope had been secretly converted into a targeting system for orbital defense platforms. Dr. Jennifer Adams worked frantically in a makeshift laboratory beneath the Pentagon, using whatever equipment she could find to analyze the alien ships. She had discovered something crucial about their technology. The energy shields that seemed impenetrable actually operated on a specific frequency that could be disrupted. "All stations, this is Defense Command," she broadcast on all emergency frequencies. "I'm sending you instructions on how to modify your radio equipment. You can turn your communications devices into shield breakers. The frequency is 847.3 terahertz. Repeat, 847.3 terahertz. Across the planet, humans began receiving the instructions and modifying whatever electronic equipment they could find. Police radios, cell phone towers, amateur radio stations, even. Car stereos were quickly converted into weapons that could disrupt alien shielding in downtown Chicago. Police Chief Mike Johnson led a mixed force of cops, former gang members, and ordinary citizens in preparing for urban warfare. They had turned the city into a maze of barricades and strongpoints, using their knowledge of the streets against invaders who had never fought in an environment like this. Remember, Johnson told his people as alien landing craft appeared in the sky above them, they're used to quick, clean victories. They don't know how to fight dirty. But we do. We use every trick, every advantage, every piece of ground. We make them pay for every block, every building, every room. The first alien landing parties touched down, expecting to find a broken population ready to surrender. Instead, they found a planet that had turned itself into a fortress, where every civilian was a potential soldier, and every building was a potential weapon. The Council had conquered 1,000 worlds, but they had never faced anything like what they found on Earth from orbit. Zexthara watched in growing amazement as its supposedly superior forces struggled against primitive human defenses. The crystalline being had expected this conquest to be finished within hours. Instead, human resistance was growing stronger with each passing minute. For the first time in 3,000 years of galactic expansion, the Council faced the possibility that they might not win. The Council landing craft descended through Earth's atmosphere like falling meteors, their hulls glowing red from the heat of entry. From his command ship in orbit, Zexthara watched the invasion begin with confidence that this would be the end of human resistance. No species had ever withstood a full planetary assault by Council forces, the crystalline being expected to be receiving surrender broadcasts within the hour. Instead, the first reports from the ground were unlike anything the Council had ever encountered. Landing Party 7 had touched down in what their sensors showed as a lightly defended urban area called Chicago. Within minutes, they were sending distress calls back to the fleet. "Command, this is Ground Leader Vexstar," came the panicked transmission from the surface. "We are under heavy fire from multiple directions. The humans are using the city structure against us. They appear to be everywhere at once." In downtown Chicago, Police Chief Mike Johnson crouched behind an overturned car, speaking into his radio headset as alien soldiers advanced down the street. Around him, his unlikely army of cops, former criminals, and ordinary citizens had turned the familiar streets into a battlefield that favored the defenders. "Team 3. They're moving past the bank building," Johnson reported. "Mrs. Williams. Can you see them from your window? 80 floors above the street." Our ED accountant, Sarah Williams, peered through her apartment window with a hunting rifle that had belonged to her late husband. "I see them, Chief," she radioed back. "Ugly green things with too many arms. Taking the shot now." The aliens found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to know every alley, every rooftop, every sewer tunnel. Human fighters would appear from manholes, fire a few shots, then disappear into subway tunnels before the aliens could respond. They used construction equipment as mobile shields and turned city buses into armored fighting vehicles. Dr. Susan Clark worked in a basement laboratory in Atlanta, surrounded by samples of alien tissue that had been recovered from crashed probes. As a biochemist, she had spent her career studying how different organisms interacted with each other. Now she was applying that knowledge to warfare in a way she had never imagined. "It's incredible," she said to her assistant as she examined alien blood under a microscope. "Their immune systems have no defense against Earth bacteria. They've been isolated in sterile environments for so long that they can't handle the microorganisms we live with every day." The alien soldiers wore advanced environmental suits that could stop bullets, and deflect energy weapons. But they couldn't stop invisible biological warfare that humans didn't even realize they were waging. Every breath of Earth air, every contact with human-touched surfaces, exposed the invaders to countless microorganisms that their bodies couldn't fight. In rural Montana, Farmer Jack Williams had organized his neighbors into a guerrilla force. That struck the alien patrols and faded back into the wilderness like ghosts. They knew every hill, every valley, every cave in their homeland. They had turned their farming equipment into weapons of war and their knowledge of the land into tactical advantages. City folks don't understand, Jack told his wife Mary as they prepared another ambush. When you've spent your whole life working the land, you know how to use it. These aliens might have fancy technology, but they don't know this ground like we do. The Council forces found themselves facing an enemy that refused to follow the rules of civilized warfare. Instead of meeting them in open battle, humans fought from shadows and struck where they were least expected. They used tactics that seemed random and chaotic, but somehow worked together in ways the aliens couldn't predict. But what truly shocked the Council was not humanity's military resistance, but their psychological warfare. Hack specialist Danny Kim worked from a basement computer lab in Seoul, using skills he had learned as a teenager to break into systems that the aliens thought were secure. After days of effort, he finally cracked the Council's communication. "Network, I'm in," he announced to his team of volunteer hackers from around the world. "I can broadcast to every ship in their fleet." What followed was unlike anything in the history of galactic warfare. Every Council ship suddenly began receiving the same transmission, recordings of human history that showed a species that had never learned to properly surrender. The Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held off a massive army until the last man fell. The Alamo, where defenders fought to the death rather than give up. Stalingrad, where an entire city became a fortress and civilians fought. House by house against invaders, the aliens watched footage of humans fighting room by room, never giving up even when defeat was certain. They saw images of soldiers charging into hopeless battles, of civilians choosing death over subjugation, of a species that seemed to view dying in battle as preferable to living on their knees. Council Prime Zexthara stared at the transmissions in growing horror. "They are showing us their defeats," it said to the other Council members. "They are proud of their defeats." Morthak clicked his mandibles nervously. "I don't understand. Why would they celebrate failure?" But Sithala, floating in her water tank, understood what they were seeing. "They're not celebrating failure," she said quietly. "They're celebrating the choice to fight impossible odds rather than surrender. They would rather die as free beings and live as our subjects." On the ground, the fighting reached a level of intensity that the Council had never experienced. General Lisa Stone coordinated global resistance from a mobile command center that moved constantly to avoid alien hunter-killer teams. She had lost contact with most of Earth's major cities, but scattered reports indicated the same thing everywhere. Humans were fighting with a fury that seemed to defy military logic. In New York, firefighter Carlos Rodriguez led civilians through collapsing buildings as plasma fire rained from the sky. His job had always been to save lives, and he continued doing it even as the city burned around him. He helped families escape from damaged apartments, guided survivors through rubble-filled streets, and somehow kept hope alive in the darkest moments. "This way," he called to a group of children whose school had been hit by alien fire. "Stay close to me. We're going to get you somewhere safe." In London, Nurse Emily Watson treated wounded resistance fighters in a makeshift hospital set up in the subway tunnels. She had no proper medical equipment, only basic supplies and her training, but she worked tirelessly to save every life she could. Above ground, alien patrols searched for the human resistance, but below ground, Emily and others like her kept the fight alive, The Council had expected to be counting their new human subjects by now. Instead, they were counting their own casualties and trying to understand how a primitive species could inflict such losses on their advanced forces. Their weapons were superior, their armor was stronger, their ships were faster, but somehow, the humans kept fighting. Reports poured in from landing sites around the globe. In Tokyo, humans had turned the subway system into an underground fortress. In Paris, civilians were using the catacombs as hidden bases. In Mexico City, the population had literally gone underground, creating a shadow city that the aliens couldn't find or destroy. "Sir," reported one of Zextara's subordinates, "our ground forces are requesting additional support. They're encountering resistance levels far beyond what we calculated." The crystalline being studied the tactical displays showing the locations of its forces around Earth. Red indicators marked areas where its troops were under attack, and there were far too many red indicators. "How is this possible?" it asked. "We have overwhelming technological superiority." "Technology isn't everything," came a voice from the communication system. It was President Morrison, somehow broadcasting from the ruins of Washington. Behind him, the American flag still flew over the wreckage, and his voice carried the determination of a species that had chosen death over defeat. "You have better weapons, better armor, better ships," Morrison continued. "But you don't understand what you're fighting. You're not just fighting humans. You're fighting the idea that some things are worth dying for. You're fighting the belief that freedom matters more than life itself. And that's a fight you can never win, no matter how many ships you have." Across the galaxy, on worlds that had been conquered centuries ago, beings who had forgotten what freedom meant listened to Morrison's words and felt something stirring in their hearts. The impossible was happening. Someone was actually fighting back against the Council and refusing to give up. ZEX single quotes THAR felt the foundations of the galactic order shaking beneath its crystalline feet as it realized that victory was no longer certain. The battle for Earth raged into its third day, and something unprecedented was happening across the galaxy. The footage of human resistance that Danny Kim had broadcast through the Council's own communication network was spreading to every conquered world in known space. For the first time in 3,000 years, subjugated species were seeing someone fight back against the Council and refuse to surrender. On the mining world of Kepler Prime, the enslaved Zorlani workers stopped their digging to watch the transmissions on hidden screens. For decades, they had labored in the deep tunnels, their spirits broken by generations of servitude. But as they watched humans die rather than kneel, something changed in their large, dark eyes. When Overseer Grixthal ordered them back to work, several Zorlani met his gaze directly, instead of looking away in submission. "Back to work, slaves," Grixthal commanded, but his voice carried less authority than before. One of the Zorlani, an old worker named Vexler, who had spent 40 years in the mines, slowly straightened his bent back. "My name is not Slave," he said quietly. "My name is Vexler, and I remember when my people were free." Similar scenes played out across dozens of worlds. In the research facilities of the Vec Theory system, crystalline beings who had been forced to develop weapons for the Council began to move slowly toward the hangar bays where old ships sat forgotten. On the ocean worlds of the Mericians, aquatic beings who had been enslaved for centuries began to gather in the deep places where the Council sensors could not reach them. Council member Vorthak reported the disturbing news to Zexthara with obvious fear in his voice. "There are stirrings among the subject species across multiple systems. Work productivity has decreased by 30%. Some groups have started gathering in ways that violate the congregation restrictions." Zexthara studied the reports flowing in from across the galactic empire. For 3 millennia, the conquered peoples had been docile and obedient. Now they were beginning to remember what they had been before the council came. Increase security. Measures on all worlds, it commanded. This rebellion must be contained. But the rebellion was spreading faster than the council could respond. The simple word no had become a virus that infected every being who heard it. On Earth, the fighting had transformed humanity in ways no one had expected. National boundaries that had divided people for centuries meant nothing now. Former enemies shared ammunition and medical supplies as if they had been allies all their lives. President Morrison coordinated with world leaders from a bunker that moved constantly to avoid alien targeting systems. The old political divisions seemed childish now compared to the simple choice between freedom and slavery. Prime Minister Helen Davies reported from London that her people were fighting alongside refugees from a dozen different countries. Chancellor Franz Müller said that German and French forces were working together as if the old wars between their nations had never happened. We're becoming something new, Morrison told the assembled leaders during one of their brief communication. Windows. We're not Americans or British or Chinese anymore. We're just humans, and we're all in this fight together. The transformation was most visible in the soldiers themselves. Colonel Steve Henderson led a mixed force of American Marines and Chinese soldiers through the ruins of Seattle, and he could barely tell the difference between them anymore. They moved as one unit, covered each other's backs, shared their rations, without thinking about which flag they had once served under. Henderson, we've got movement 3 blocks north, reported Sergeant Liu Chun, a Chinese soldier who spoke English with an accent, but fought with the same courage as any Marine. Copy that, Chun. Rodriguez, take your team around the east side. Kim, you're with me down the middle, Henderson replied, coordinating American, Mexican, and Korean fighters as if they had trained together their whole lives. The real shock came when Captain Beth Miller, commanding the partially destroyed lunar base, detected new signatures on her long-range sensors. Ships were approaching from across the galaxy, but they were not Council reinforcements. They were old vessels from the conquered worlds, ships that had been hidden away for centuries and were now flying toward Earth. The first to arrive was a Zorlani, mining vessel that had been converted into a warship with whatever weapons its crew could find. The ship was ancient and crude compared to Council technology, but it flew the banner of a free people for the first time in generations. Earth Command, this is Free Captain Dexler of the vessel Liberation, came the transmission. We heard. Someone finally said no to the Council. We're here to help. More ships followed throughout the day. Mauritians sent their deep space exploration vessels, armed with harpoon launchers and depth charges. The crystalline Vec Theory emerged from hidden bases in dead asteroid systems, their ships glowing with barely contained energy. Even some Council species began to defect, their crews no longer willing to fight for an empire that suddenly seemed less invincible. Dr. Jennifer Adams worked frantically from her mobile laboratory, analyzing the new alien technologies and finding ways to integrate them with human systems. Each arriving ship brought different weapons and defensive systems that could be adapted to Earth's needs. The Zorlani have mining lasers that can cut through Council armor, she reported to the Defense Coordination Center. The Mauritians have some kind of sonic weapon that disrupts their communication systems. If we can combine these technologies with our own innovations, we might actually have a chance. Council Prime Zexthara faced something it had never experienced. In its 1,000-year existence, the first galactic rebellion in 3 millennia. Reports poured in from across the empire of uprisings on dozens of worlds. Species that had been conquered centuries ago were remembering their warrior traditions and turning against their overlords. Sir, we're receiving reports of open rebellion. On 17 systems, reported one of its subordinates, its voice shaking with disbelief. The Zorlani had seized control of 3 mining worlds. The Mauricians have declared independence in the Outer Rim. Even some of our own garrison commanders are requesting permission to withdraw. The crystalline being stared at the tactical displays, showing its empire fragmenting like glass struck by a hammer. The unthinkable was happening. The eternal order was collapsing because one primitive world had refused to surrender. Zexthara opened a communication channel to Earth, something it had never imagined it would need to do. President Morrison appeared. On the screen, broadcasting from the ruins of the White House. Behind him, the American flag still flew over the rubble, tattered but unbroken. The Galactic Council requests terms for negotiation, Zexthara said, the words feeling like poison in its crystalline throat. Morrison looked directly into the camera, his face dirty and bloodied from 3 days of fighting, but his eyes still, blazing with defiance. The terms are simple, he said. Leave, all of you. Every conquered world gets to choose its own path. No more tribute, no more slavery, no more subjugation. The age of the Council is over. That is impossible, Zexthara protested. The Galactic Order has existed for 3,000 years. Civilization requires structure, hierarchy, control. Civilization requires freedom, Morrison replied. And freedom is not something you can take away from people who are willing to die for it. You can kill us all, but you can't make us kneel. And now the whole galaxy knows that resistance is possible. As if to emphasize his point, more ships arrived in Earth orbit. Free vessels from across the galaxy, their crews having broken the O. Chains of centuries to join a fight they had thought was impossible. The Liberation Fleet grew larger by the hour as word spread that someone was finally standing up to the Council. Zexthara looked at the tactical display, showing its once mighty fleet surrounded by a growing armada of free ships, and realized that the war was already lost. Not because of superior numbers or better weapons, but because of something far more powerful, the idea that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. 1 year later, Ambassador Rachel Stone stood in the newly established Galactic Assembly on a space station built from the wreckage of Council ships. Around her, representatives from hundreds of free worlds worked together as equals, their species united not by conquest but by choice. In her hand, she carried a small blue flag with white stars, a reminder that sometimes the smallest voice could change the entire universe by simply refusing to be silenced. The age of empire was over, and the age of freedom had begun with a single word spoken by a species that had never learned to surrender. No.